The Ashspire Mountains had stood for 1,000 years under dragon rule. The peaks were sharp and black, cutting into the sky like broken teeth. Snow never melted on the upper ridges. Clouds gathered there permanently, thick and gray, hiding the highest towers of the imperial palace from the world below. It was a place built to remind everyone who passed through it that dragons were old and powerful, and not to be questioned. Empress Verithra was the oldest and most powerful of them all. She was enormous even by dragon standards. Her scales were the deep color of charcoal, layered like armor across her neck and shoulders. Her eyes were amber, pale and sharp, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. She had ruled the Ashspire Mountains for longer than most kingdoms had existed. Generals feared her. Lords obeyed her. Even the wind seemed to move differently around her, as if it too understood its place. But today, Empress Verithra was not thinking about war or politics or power. Today her eggs were hatching. The nest chamber was deep inside the palace, carved directly into the mountain rock. The walls were warm from the heat vents below. Thick stone pillars rose from the floor, wrapped in old carvings of past emperors and battles long finished. The chamber smelled of heat and dry stone and something older, something that had no name. 3 eggs sat in the center of the nest. They were pale. Not white exactly, but close, the color of old bone washed clean by rain. Each one was large, smooth, and faintly glowing with a soft inner light that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. The court had gathered along the edges of the chamber. Lords and generals and advisors, all standing in silence, all watching. No one spoke. No one moved. These were not ordinary eggs. Pale hatchlings were rare. They appeared maybe once in several generations and always in the imperial line. The old text said they carried something special, a connection to the deep magic of the mountains, a bond with the land itself. They were seen as a sign that the empire would continue, that the bloodline was still strong. Verithra had waited 30 years for these eggs. She stood at the edge of the nest, watching, her great body still. Her tail moved slowly behind her, the only sign that she was not made of stone herself. The first crack appeared just before midday. It was small at first, a thin line running down the side of the largest egg. Then another crack. Then a sound, a dry, splitting sound that echoed off the stone walls. The court leaned forward as one. Verithra did not move, but her eyes sharpened. The shell broke open in pieces. The first hatchling came out slowly. It was tiny compared to its mother, small enough to fit in 2 human hands side by side. Its scales were pale silver, almost white, damp from the egg. It blinked its eyes open. They were pale too, a light, washed-out gray that looked almost colorless in the dim chamber light. The court let out a low sound of amazement. The other 2 eggs cracked open shortly after. The second hatchling was slightly smaller, its scales more white than silver. The third was the smallest of all and came out last, blinking slowly and shaking the pieces of shell from its back. 3 pale hatchlings. All breathing. All alive. The court was very quiet now, watching, waiting. Verithra stepped closer. She lowered her great head toward the nest, bringing herself down to the level of her newborns. She made a sound, low and rumbling, the sound a dragon mother makes to call her young. It was an old sound, instinctive, something passed down through generations without being taught. The hatchlings did not respond. They sat in the broken shells, blinking slowly. Their eyes moved, but not toward their mother. Not toward the court. Not toward anything in particular. They simply sat, still and silent, like 3 small pale stones. Verithra made the sound again. Louder this time. Nothing. A murmur moved through the court. One of the generals shifted his weight. An advisor near the back exchanged a quick glance with another. Verithra noticed all of it, but she said nothing. She stepped back, her expression unreadable, and waited. Minutes passed. The hatchlings did not move toward food. Did not cry. Did not make any sound at all. The chamber grew tense. Then the door at the far end of the chamber opened. It was not supposed to open. The guards were posted outside with clear orders. No one enters during the hatching. But the door opened anyway, slowly, pushed from outside by small hands that were not strong enough to move it quickly. A child walked in. He was young, perhaps 4 years old, with messy brown hair and a dirty shirt that was too big for him. His feet were bare. His eyes were wide and curious, moving around the chamber without any sign of fear. He was holding a small piece of bread in one hand, left over from his breakfast. His name was Leo. His father Gil worked in the palace grounds, trimming hedges and clearing paths, one of the many quiet workers who kept the imperial palace running. Leo had followed a noise down a hallway he was not supposed to be in, pushed open a door he was not supposed to touch, and walked into a room full of dragons without understanding what that meant. He looked at the pale hatchlings in the nest. They looked at him. And then, for the first time since they had broken free of their shells, all 3 pale hatchlings lifted their heads. Leo did not know he was supposed to be afraid. He looked at the 3 pale hatchlings the way any small child looks at something new and interesting. His head tilted slightly to one side. His mouth opened a little. Then he smiled, the wide and easy smile of a child who had not yet learned that some things in the world were dangerous. He took a step closer. Behind him, the entire court of the Dragon Empress stood frozen. No one moved. No one breathed. A general with 30 years of battle behind him stood completely still, unable to decide what to do. An advisor who had counsel for every situation in the empire had nothing. They all just watched. Verithra watched too. Leo walked up to the edge of the nest and looked down at the 3 hatchlings. They were looking back at him. Their pale gray eyes were wide and fixed on his face. Their heads were raised, all 3 of them, which they had not done for anyone else since they hatched. Leo held out the piece of bread in his hand. The largest hatchling leaned forward and sniffed it. Its small nostrils flared. It pulled back once, then leaned forward again. Then, very carefully, it took the bread from Leo's fingers with the very tip of its mouth. Leo laughed. It was a bright, ringing sound, completely out of place in the ancient stone chamber. It bounced off the carved walls and the high ceiling and filled every corner of the room. Several members of the court flinched at the sound. Verithra did not flinch, but something moved behind her amber eyes. The hatchling swallowed the bread. Then it pushed its nose against Leo's hand, looking for more. Leo giggled and reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out another small piece, crumbled and soft. He broke it into 3 pieces without thinking about it, the way a child shares without being told to, and held the pieces out flat on his palm. All 3 hatchlings came forward. They ate from his hand, carefully, their tiny heads bent over his small fingers. Their pale scales caught the warm light of the chamber and glowed faintly. Leo stood very still while they ate, which was remarkable for a child his age, as if some quiet instinct in him understood that stillness was needed. When the bread was gone, the smallest hatchling climbed up and sat on Leo's foot. Leo looked down at it and laughed again. Then he sat down, right there in the nest, cross-legged on the warm stone, and the hatchlings moved toward him immediately. The largest one pressed against his left side. The second curled across his legs. The smallest stayed on his foot and then slowly worked its way up to his lap. Leo put both his hands on them gently, the way a child pets a small animal, and the hatchlings made a sound. It was a soft sound. Low and gentle, somewhere between a hum and a rumble. None of the dragons in the chamber had ever heard a pale hatchling make that sound before. Verithra had not heard it either. She stared at her 3 newborns, piled around a barefoot human child with breadcrumbs on his shirt, making a sound she did not recognize, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt confused. She gave a quiet signal to the nearest guard. The guard stepped forward carefully and reached down to lift Leo away from the nest. Leo did not fight it. He looked up at the guard with mild curiosity as he was lifted, and the hatchlings watched him go. The moment he was separated from them, the sound stopped. The hatchlings went still. Then the smallest one made a sharp, high cry. Not the soft sound from before. This was distress, clear and immediate. The other 2 joined in quickly, their pale heads turning in the direction Leo had been taken, their small bodies pressing toward the edge of the nest. The guard stopped walking. Leo turned in the guard's arms and looked back at the hatchlings with a small worried frown on his face. He reached one hand out toward them. The crying got louder. Verithra raised one clawed hand and the guard stopped completely, standing still in the middle of the chamber with the child in his arms. The Empress looked at her hatchlings. They were crying toward Leo. Not toward her. Not toward the warm nest or the food that had been prepared. Toward the small human boy. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a low controlled voice, "Put him back." The guard obeyed without question. The moment Leo was set back down near the nest, the crying stopped. The hatchlings moved to him immediately, pressing against his sides, settling around him again. Leo wrapped his arms around the nearest one and patted its back gently. The court was silent. No one looked directly at the Empress. That was always the wisest choice when Verithra was working through something difficult. Her tail moved slowly across the floor behind her. Her eyes stayed on the hatchlings and the boy. One of her senior advisors stepped forward carefully and spoke in a low voice. He suggested this was temporary. A novelty, perhaps. The hatchlings were newborn and simply responding to the first warm presence they encountered. It would pass. Verithra said nothing. She watched Leo lean down and press his forehead gently against the largest hatchling's nose. The hatchling closed its eyes. Yes, Varithra said finally, her voice flat and unreadable. It is temporary. But she did not sound convinced. 3 days passed. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen above the black peaks of the Ashspire Mountains, Leo came to the nest chamber. He came the same way each time, padding down the long stone corridor in his bare feet, his hair uncombed, usually still chewing something from breakfast. The guards had stopped trying to redirect him after the first morning. They had received no orders to keep him out, and the Empress had not told them otherwise, so they simply stepped aside and let him pass. Leo never noticed that this was unusual. He walked in like it was his room. The hatchlings always heard him coming before he reached the door. By the time it opened, all 3 of them were already at the edge of the nest, their pale heads raised, their gray eyes fixed on the entrance. When Leo appeared, the soft rumbling sound started immediately, filling the chamber with warmth before he had even sat down. He had named them by the second day. The largest one, the one who always came to him first, he called Ash. He chose the name because the hatchling's scales reminded him of the color of cold fireplace ash, pale and silver and quiet. The second one, slightly smaller and always the most curious, he called Pip. Leo said it suited him because he was quick and sharp-eyed, always poking his nose into things. The smallest one, the one who had sat on his foot on the very first day, he called Dot, because she had a small pale mark on the top of her head that was slightly lighter than the rest of her scales. Ash, Pip, and Dot. The court heard these names repeated every morning and said nothing out loud. But several of them pressed their mouths together very tightly. Leo played with them the way he played with everything, without rules and without a plan. He rolled a smooth stone across the floor and watched them chase it. He made a small pile of pebbles and let them knock it down. He lay flat on his back on the warm stone floor and let all 3 of them climb on him, which they did with great enthusiasm, until he was completely buried under pale silver scales and small clawed feet, and he laughed so hard that his whole body shook. The hatchlings made the rumbling sound louder when he laughed. He talked to them constantly. Not in the way someone talks to an animal expecting nothing back, but in the way a child talks to a friend. He told them about the garden where his father worked, about the big hedges shaped like birds and the stone path that was always cold in the morning. He told them about a cat that lived near the kitchen and never let anyone touch it. He told Pip that he was being greedy when he ate the most at feeding time, and Pip looked at him with wide eyes and then ate more anyway. It was ordinary. It was completely, bafflingly ordinary. And Varithra watched all of it. She did not come into the chamber openly. There was a high gallery above the nest room, a narrow walkway used in old times by imperial observers during hatching ceremonies. It had not been used in decades. Varithra had been using it every morning for 3 days, standing in the shadows above, looking down at her pale hatchlings and the small human boy who had become the center of their world. She told herself she was monitoring the situation. She told herself it was a matter of imperial concern, that the welfare of the pale hatchlings was a matter of state, and therefore her presence in the gallery was entirely practical and not at all because she could not stop watching. She watched Leo press his ear against Ash's chest, listening, with the focused expression of a child doing something very important. She watched him carefully examine one of Dot's small claws, turning the tiny foot over in his hands like he was studying something precious. She watched him tell Pip a long and detailed story about a frog he had once found in the palace garden, using his hands to show how big it was, which was apparently very big indeed. The hatchlings watched him the entire time. They never looked away from him. On the morning of the 4th day, Varithra came down from the gallery. She did not tell herself why. She simply walked down the back stairs and came through the side entrance of the nest chamber, her great body moving quietly for something so large. The guards at the entrance straightened immediately. Leo did not hear her come in. He was sitting with his back to the door, Dot curled in his lap, Ash pressed against his right side, Pip chewing the edge of his sleeve in a thoughtful sort of way. Varithra crossed the chamber floor. Her footsteps were heavy enough that the stones trembled slightly. Leo felt it before he heard it, a low vibration coming up through the floor. He turned around. He looked up at the Empress of the Ashspire Mountains, who was large enough to block out the light from 3 lanterns behind her, whose shadow covered him completely, whose amber eyes were fixed on him from a height that should have made any creature feel very small and very afraid. Leo looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ash and then at Pip and then at Dot in his lap. Then he looked back up at Varithra with a calm and thoughtful expression. "Are you their mum?" he asked. It was a simple question. No fear in it. No hesitation. Just a small boy asking something he genuinely wanted to know, the way children ask questions, directly and without apology. Varithra opened her mouth. And for the first time in a very long time, the Empress of the Ashspire Mountains had absolutely nothing to say. Varithra did not answer Leo's question that morning. She stood in the nest chamber, looking down at the small boy with her pale hatchlings curled around him, and she simply turned and walked back out through the side entrance without a word. The guards outside said nothing. The court advisors who heard about it later said nothing either, at least not where anyone important could hear them. But that night, Varithra sat alone in her high chamber at the top of the palace and thought. She thought for a long time. She pulled up every memory she had of her own hatching, of the days that followed, of what her mother had done and what the imperial tradition demanded. It had been formal. Structured. There were specific sounds a dragon mother was supposed to make at specific intervals. There were correct distances to maintain. There were rituals for feeding and rituals for first flight training and rituals for everything in between. Every step was written down in old texts that had not been questioned in centuries. Warmth was not in any of those texts. Play was not mentioned once. She thought about Ash chasing a smooth stone across the floor. She thought about Pip stealing the edge of Leo's sleeve and chewing it with great satisfaction. She thought about Dot, the smallest, pressing her pale head under Leo's chin and closing her eyes completely, every muscle in her small body relaxed in a way that Varithra had never seen in a hatchling before. She thought about the sound they made when Leo was near. That low, soft rumbling that filled the chamber like heat. She had never heard that sound in the imperial nest before. Not once. Not in her own hatching. Not in any hatching she had witnessed in the centuries since. She had assumed it was simply something pale hatchlings did not do. Something they were not built for. It had not occurred to her, until now, that perhaps they had simply never been given a reason to make it. The next morning she did not go to the gallery. She went to the groundskeeper's quarters near the eastern garden wall. Gil answered the door with the look of a man who has just seen something that might end badly for him. He was a lean, quiet man with calloused hands and careful eyes. He bowed immediately, deeply, and kept his eyes on the floor. Varithra told him she was not there for him. She asked if his wife was present, and came to the door a moment later. She was a small woman, not much taller than the door handle was wide, with the same brown hair as Leo and steady hands that did not shake even when she found an ancient dragon empress standing in her doorway. She looked up at Varithra with calm, serious eyes and waited. Varithra looked at her for a moment. Then she asked, simply and without ceremony, "How do humans raise their young?" and was quiet for just a second. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Would you like to come in?" It was a very small room for a very large empress. Varithra had to fold herself down considerably to fit, and even then her tail extended out through the open doorway into the garden. She sat on the floor because there was nothing else available that would hold her, and then sat across from her on a low wooden chair without any sign that this was unusual, and spoke plainly. She said that human children needed to be held. Not occasionally but often, and for no reason other than to feel that someone was there. She said they needed to hear voices, warm voices, talking to them even when they were too young to understand the words. She said they needed to play not because play taught them anything specific, but because play was how they learned that the world was not something to fear. She said that when a child cried, you went to them. Not after a suitable interval. Not when it was convenient. You went immediately every time so that they learned that their distress would always be answered. She said that love for humans was not a thing kept separate from daily life. It was in the small things. The shared bread. The named creatures. The patient explanations of what a frog looked like and how big it was. Varithra listened to all of it without moving. At one point and paused and asked carefully if she had said something wrong. Varithra told her to continue. When and finished, the chamber was quiet. Varithra looked at the floor of the small room, at the worn stone and the simple rug and the low table where Leo had clearly been sitting that morning because there were crumbs on it and a small drawing of something that might have been a pale dragon or might have been a cloud with legs. She thought about imperial tradition. About the correct distances. About the rituals that had been followed without question for hundreds of years while pale hatchlings hatched cold and silent and were called strong for it. She thought about Ash pressing against Leo's side in the dark of the nest chamber, just to be close to something warm. Something shifted inside Varithra. It was not comfortable. Pride never cracks open comfortably. It makes a slow and painful sound, like old stone giving way, and it leaves something tender and unguarded underneath that has not seen light in a very long time. She stood, carefully, unfolding herself back through the doorway into the garden. She paused before she left. Without turning around she said quietly, "Your son is good with them." Anne's voice came from inside the room, steady and soft. She said he loves them. That is all he is doing. Varithra walked back through the garden without answering. But she went to the nest chamber that morning, and this time she did not go to the gallery. She went inside. The court had been patient for 5 days. That was longer than most of them had managed with anything they disagreed with, and by the morning of the 6th day the patience was finished. The senior advisors gathered in the long hall outside the Imperial Council chamber and spoke in low, tight voices about the situation. By midday they had agreed that something needed to be said. By the afternoon they had decided who would say it. Lord Dren was the oldest member of the Imperial Court. He had served 3 empresses before Varithra and survived all of them, which was not a small thing. He was large, gray-scaled, and had the particular confidence of someone who had lived long enough to believe his own opinion was the same as fact. He requested an audience with the Empress. Varithra received him in the council chamber. She sat at the head of the long stone table, still and straight, her amber eyes steady. Lord Dren stood at the other end and spoke with the careful firmness of someone who had prepared what he was going to say and intended to say all of it. He said that the situation in the nest chamber had gone on long enough. He said that the pale hatchlings were imperial symbols, creatures of prophecy and bloodline, and that their constant association with a groundskeeper's child was damaging to the dignity of the empire. He said that the court had discussed it at length and agreed that the boy needed to be permanently removed from the palace grounds, along with his father, and that suitable arrangements could be made to ensure the family was comfortable elsewhere. He said it was not personal. It was simply a matter of what was appropriate. He waited for Varithra to agree. Varithra looked at him for a long moment. She did not speak immediately. Lord Dren had seen that pause before and had always found it unsettling. Then she said, "You are suggesting I remove the one living creature my hatchlings have bonded with, in the first week of their lives, because it makes the court uncomfortable." Lord Dren said that was not exactly how he would phrase it. Varithra said it was exactly how she would phrase it. The chamber was very quiet. She stood then, slowly, her full height filling the space in a way that reminded everyone present why 3 empresses before her had also not argued with her for long. She looked at Lord Dren and then at the other advisors standing behind him along the wall. She told them that Leo, son of Gil the groundskeeper, was from that day forward to be known as Ward of the Imperial Nest. She said the title had never been given before because the court had never before had cause to recognize that a child's kindness was worth more to the empire than its own pride. She said the boy and his family would remain in the palace, in better quarters than they currently occupied, and that anyone who raised the subject of his removal again would find themselves explaining their reasoning from somewhere considerably further away than the council chamber. She walked out before anyone could respond. Lord Dren stood at the end of the long table for a moment. Then he sat down heavily in the nearest chair and said nothing at all. That evening, Leo did not know any of this had happened. He came to the nest chamber the way he always did, a little before the light faded, because his mother had told him he needed to be back for dinner, but he always stopped in first. He had brought a small piece of dried fruit from the kitchen, something he had been saving since morning, and he divided it into 3 pieces before he even sat down. Ash took his piece immediately. Pip sniffed his piece for a long time before eating it. Dot tucked hers under her chin first, looked at it for a while, and then ate it very slowly as if she wanted to think about it properly. Leo sat with them on the warm stone floor as the light through the high windows turned orange and then gold. He did not notice at first that he was not alone. Varithra had come in through the side entrance again, quietly for her size, and had settled herself along the far wall of the chamber. Not in the gallery above. Not in the doorway. In the chamber itself, on the floor, her great body folded down as small as it could go, which was still very large but somehow felt different from her usual presence. Less like a wall. More like something that was trying, carefully, to take up less space than it owned. Leo looked over and saw her. He looked back at Dot, who was now climbing his arm. Then he looked back at Varithra and said, "Do you want to sit closer?" Varithra did not answer immediately. Then she moved, slowly, crossing the chamber floor and settling a few feet away from where Leo sat. Close enough that her warmth reached him. Close enough that Ash, always the boldest, walked over and sniffed her foot and then walked back to Leo without any particular concern. Leo watched this and smiled. He did not say anything else. He went back to sitting with Pip and Dot, talking to them in his low, easy voice about nothing important. Varithra sat beside him and watched. She watched the way he held Dot without gripping her. The way he let Pip climb where he wanted without redirecting him. The way he simply stayed present and calm and available, and how that alone seemed to be enough. After a while all 3 hatchlings were spread across both of them. Ash across Leo's legs and Varithra's tail. Pip tucked against Leo's side. Dot asleep on the Empress's foreleg with Leo's hand resting gently beside her. The chamber was warm and quiet. Varithra looked at her pale hatchlings, finally still, finally soft, finally making that low and gentle sound she had not known they were capable of until a small boy with bread in his pocket had walked through the wrong door. She did not say anything. She did not need to. For the first time in centuries, there were no titles in the room. No court, no tradition, no correct distance to maintain. There was just a mother and her children, and the small human boy who had shown her, without meaning to, what she had forgotten. The hatchlings slept. And the empress stayed until the last light left the windows and the chamber was warm and dark and perfectly still.